Hello, everyone. Good to see so many of you already here for this History Indoors talk. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic. So, hello to all you. Please let us know in the comments where you're from and where you're tuning in from. We've always had people coming in from so many different places. Ranging from America, Canada, Portugal, and all throughout the country. So please do let us know where you are tuning in from. We would love to hear where you are from. Now, for those who are new to History Indoors, let me introduce what we are. We are an organisation, a voluntary group, or whatever we call us, who provide free history contents on a variety of topics, ranging from going back to the ancient world, the Romans and the Saxons and the Vikings, all the way through to the contemporary world as well, World War II, even to going into the present day. So we have cover a wide range of eras, wide range of topics: military, economic, social histories. So if you do want to check out any of our content, just go check our videos here on YouTube. You can find anything you're looking for. There's so much stuff on there, hundreds of talks now, or hundreds of videos anyway. So please do go check them out when you have the chance. We'd love to have you join part of the community here at History Indoors. Don't forget to subscribe as well. We'd love to see that number go up, don't we, James? Get the the high numbers. We reach 1,300 subscribers, which I think is wonderful. So please do add to that community. We'd love to see you join us here, and do like the video as well, because it means more people can see it and interact with it. More likes, the better the video does. So please do like if you get a chance. But you're not really here to hear me waffle on about History Indoors or waffle about myself. I mean, I could do, but you're not here to listen to Michael at all. Instead, you're here to hear from James. Now, James Jefferies, as his full name is, has given a lot of talks for History Indoors. I don't know how many talks it is, James. Now
I've done seven on my own. I worked out earlier. I don't know how many altogether, joint talks and stuff. So yeah.
So yeah, you're putting double digits, I imagine. I think.
Oh yeah.
Talk-wise. And then he's done loads of stuff with us for the film aspect we did all those years ago. So he's been a massive part of History Indoors, and he's given talks, which most of them have been actually our highest hits videos. So he can hold that record as well. And his talks are absolutely fascinating on World War I and World War II and stuff as well. So absolutely wonderful. Now James is doing his PhD at University of Essex. He's doing the cultural memory of the RAF in Britain from the Second World War. I think I got that one right.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm not doing too bad. Now, obviously, we'd let you know, James, when you finish your PhD, I'm sure people want to read it as well. So make sure you tell people about it when it's all done. Because I'm interested in it as well. As you know, I'm interested in reading it. So make sure you share it with us all, so we can all be an integral part of that. Now, I'm interested in this topic, James, because obviously you know my history, my grandfather and not. So I'm really looking forward to this talk about Bomber Command in film, TV, and radio. But what I'll do is I'll disappear, because people aren't here to listen to me waffle on. They're here to hear you. But just for everyone's knowledge, at the end there'll be a Q&A. So please do put your questions in throughout the talk, and at the end we'll come and we'll be able to, me and James will be able to discuss those questions and answer those questions, and hopefully it'll be a fun little time together. So that being said, I'll disappear. James, take it away, and I'll see you guys on the other side. So bye for now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone who has come to watch this today. As Michael says, damn good show. I'm looking at RAF Bomber Command in film, TV, and radio. So this is about RAF Bomber Command in the Second World War and how they've been portrayed, basically, how their the story of RAF Bomber Command in the Second World War has also been consumed by the public and such like, and how film, television, and radio has been influenced by the evolving history, and how it itself has influenced wider discussions and understandings, and as different generations come in and such like. This is kind of a part two. I did a very similar video looking at RAF Fighter Command, mainly in the Battle of Britain, and I kind of thought, well, I mentioned Bomber Command, but I want to talk about them exclusively. So this is really what it is. So as I say, it's almost a part two to start talking about the bomber crews. But we'll go over the structure. So I'm going to start off initially talking about before the war. I think it's important because there is this setup. There are films about war in the air, especially about the First World War, but projecting what the next war might look like. And the bomber and the air crews are an important part of this, and setting that in wider British understanding. It's mainly looking at British cultural understanding, but of course, I'm going to bring in that international element. And as television and film develop and you get the onset of streaming, it does become more of an international understanding, and there are international influences onto British culture. Then going to look at film, the 1950s to the 1980s, before going to the small screen, just reeling it back, 1970s, 1980s, radio very briefly, 1990s to today, and then finally a summary and conclusion. It's generally chronological, as you can see, but it's also thematic as well. So there is a little bit of jumping around, but I am trying to generally keep it chronological. It's not full analysis of everything, so if I miss something, I do apologize. I've just selected what I think are key examples really to bring forward to try and explain this story and this narrative and this understanding of RAF Bomber Command. I could have included so much. I mean, there's things like the Dambusters Carling Black Label advert. I could have talked about advertisements and such like, but I have to draw a line somewhere. I've only got X amount of time to talk about things. You're gonna have to read the thesis when it's available, if you are still interested, of course. And yeah, let's carry on and start. So we're looking at films before and during the war to begin with. You've had from the First World War, and this is something else that I've discussed, the notion of the noble flyer, the knight in the air, the dashing fighter pilot. It's, yeah, to use a word, it's sexy to be an aircraft, especially a pilot, a fighter pilot. It's dashing. There's this notion of chivalry linked to it, the notion of the air race and such like. And the first film I want to talk about is Hell's Angels, which is actually an American film. Now, the reason I mention it is during the First World War, mainland Britain was bombed by Zeppelin airships and then Gotha bombers. And this film is set during the First World War. It has airships bombing Trafalgar Square. It is, of course, thwarted by the efforts of the Royal Flying Corps, which would later become the RAF. And the RFC then go on and successfully, of course, bomb a German ammunition dump. And there's a fair amount in it about the morality of war. So the Germans are attacking, an area of non-competence of civilians in Trafalgar Square. But the Royal Flying Corps is, of course, attacking military installations. So that sets a little bit of a precedent and a moral sort of standing with this as well. So I think it's important. It's a popular film as well. I'm then going to talk about, if we look at the right of the screen, Things to Come. Now, this was actually an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel. H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine and numerous other books. The thing to bring this out is it comes out in 1936, and it's got a bombing scene of bombers attacking London. Now, over the course of the interwar years, there is this growing sense of fear of the bomber, that the bomber, to quote Stanley Baldwin, British Prime Minister, will always get through. And in fact, there is this idea that the bomber might actually make ground warfare redundant. So there is this huge fear. And of course, during the 1930s, we have events in the Civil War in Spain, the bombing of Guernica. We have Abyssinia and China bombings that involve chemical warfare as well, gassing and such like. So this fear is very, very real. And with this, there are advocates like Trenchard and Dewey that are really emphasizing this and how important it is to have a fleet of bombers. And actually, there is this idea that there could be this deterrent factor. So it might avoid war if nations have huge numbers of bombers. It will deter the others, a bit like mutually assured destruction, I guess, that you have in the Cold War in that sort of sense, that no one's going to want to attack because these bombers are going to come through and absolutely destroy infrastructure and are going to cause riots and all this sort of stuff. But just leading into the war, you have The Lion Has Wings in 1939. It's got Ralph Richardson, the great Ralph Richardson, Sir Ralph, who's later in the film Battle of Britain in 1969. Now, this, as well as a reassurance of the air defence of Britain, and it shows the defence system and the fighters thwarting an air attack, it then shows scenes of RAF bombers, Wellingtons, bombing warships in retaliation. And this, of course, both succeed. The fighters succeed in thwarting, the bombers succeed in destroying the warships. It's all very happy. Now, This again sets a precedent of the two arms of the Air Force and the sense of the fighters and the bombers, and that, yeah, this is how it's going to play out. Now, interestingly enough, the war starts in 1939, and RAF bombers do go and attack German warships, but it doesn't play out like it does in the film. Many are shot down. The raids aren't successful. You have instances of bombs bouncing off off of the ships and into the sea, and yeah, it's heavy losses for the day, and eventually leads to the majority of RAF Bomber Command flying by night. So yeah, it's interesting though, but it does set this precedence to the British public that it will be a bomber's war. When you take all of these films together and how it's portrayed and what's happening with the advocates of bombing and such like, and that it could potentially be a means of victory. Now, I use that phrase, Winston Churchill, an advocate of the bomber, uses this in 1940 to describe RAF Bomber Command as the means of victory. The fighters will be our salvation. The bombers alone will be the means of victory. So the war starts. And one of the things you really need is, well, you need aircrew, don't you? You're building up this force. You're going to have losses. So a lot of the films during the war really are about joining up. And you've got the poster there for one of the films, Target for Tonight, 1941. It says join the RAF or the WAAF, the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And that is really what it needs. I mean, you have films like The First of the Few, which is focused on the fighters. And I mean, I could go into that, and I did mention that obviously in my Battle of Britain talk. But the Battle of Britain has been won. It's the next stage. It's about taking the war to the enemy. And this is, again, what a lot of these films say. So Target for Tonight, 1941, it shows a successful raid, obviously, on Germany. It uses scenes with actual RAF personnel, which I think is really, really interesting. And it's sold on this. And it's sold on the hitting back. And it's not just about the aircrew. It shows the ground personnel. It shows the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. It's like, you could be a part of this. You could be a key part of taking the war to Germany whilst you've got this period immediately after the Battle of Britain. And of course, that's something that the RAF is doing. It wants to be on the offensive after the Battle of Britain. So it's not just Bomber Command. Fighter Command are now having fighter sweeps over northern France and northwest Europe. So yeah, these films fit in with that. Now you have another film, 1941 as well. One of our aircraft is missing. This is a drama which shows, again, another successful raid, but the crew of this Wellington bomber are shot down and they barrel out over the Netherlands. And it shows the Dutch resistance helping the aircrew escape and get back to carry on the fight. Now, the Netherlands initially was neutral, but invaded in May 1940. And so it will be a place that aircrew are going to be flying over. So I think it's a nod to that, and I really like the nod to the Dutch resistance and such like as well, and the escape routes. It's a really entertaining film, actually. You've then got Journey Together. So this is slightly later. It's near the end of the war, but the spirit is very much about the crew. It's very much about it not being about pilots. So you've had the Battle of Britain, you've had the First World War, where it is the exciting thing to be a fighter pilot, to fly Spitfires and such like. Well, this film goes, it's not all about pilots. In fact, the most important people are navigators, etc., are bomb aimers, are gunners. It's about a team effort. And it's also about the team on the ground, and it's about learning, and it's about teamwork. And it's got a great cast. It's got Jack Watling, Richard Attenborough as well. You can see there, both of them pictured. And it's mainly the story of them joining up and then training and becoming this crew. So that really is sort of like setting up sort of the film element during the war. And I also want to now talk about a play that was written during the war, Flarepath, written by Terrence Rattigan, who you can see there is in an RAF uniform. He was in the RAF. He wrote the script for Journey Together, but then wrote the play, or beforehand had written the play Flarepath. This is a really, really interesting play. It's about love and loss. It's very emotional. It's about coming to terms and dealing with the war and what it means. There are lots of social cultural commentaries on the RAF and also Britishness and such like. The main character is a pilot who falls in love with another man's wife, so you've got this love triangle element and such like. It has a Polish married couple in it, and the man is in the RAF and serves perhaps a little bit as a comic element, but it is light-hearted, and it is a nod to the Polish element in the Royal Air Force, which of course played an important role along with numerous other nations that were a part of RAF Bomber Command and the RAF and the Allied effort. And this nod is perhaps one of the first, along with the film Dangerous Moonlight, which I talked about in my other talk. But I have to give a nod to Flarepath there. Now we're coming sort of to the end of the war, and yeah, the war has ended. There's this crossover with a couple of films that I want to mention. And Flarepath was actually very much developed into the film The Way to the Stars. As again, it's Terrence Rattigan. It's got the great John Mills in it, who's, gosh, I can't even begin to name the films like Dunkirk, in which we serve, and gosh, he's just ice cold in Alex. So many of these war films. It's about Bomber Command, RAF Bomber Command, but it's also looking at the United States Army Air Force and the relationship between the two. It's very, very much about this sense of teamwork. It's about it. So it starts off in the Battle of Britain. You've got John Mills as a fresh recruit going to the bomber station. And then it develops through into 1942 and eventually to 1945. And the war doesn't end within it. But it starts off with a scene with an abandoned airfield, and it kind of retrospectively looks, again, it's got lots of social cultural elements to it. It's got a lot of commentary about the RAF and the people within it. And the other thing is, apart from a raid on the airfield, there's no battle scenes. You see the crews take off, you see the survivors land, etc. And one scene that I do want to highlight is a nod to Fighter Command during it, where these 3 Hurricanes are scrambled to intercept the raid. And one of them flies over, and John Mills and the station commander are walking along, and they say these fighter pilots show off with their victory rolls and top buttons undone. Another Hurricane flies past, says, "Oh, they're real show-offs." And then he asks John Mills's character, "Can you see the third?" And they can't. And he says, "Well, of course, that doesn't mean to say they're not doing a great job." And I just absolutely love that scene. I really recommend this film. I've got a massive soft spot for it. I really like what it does. As I say, great cast. They're Bill Owen, that plays an air gunner in it, who you might know from Last of the Summer Wine and many other films as well. Michael Redgrave, oh gosh, Rosamund Johns, who's also in the first of the few. Absolutely brilliant cast. Another film I want to mention is A Matter of Life and Death. So you've got David Niven there. You can see the picture on the right. Again, he was in First of the Few as well. Dashing sort of Lancaster pilot who at the start of the film falls in love with this radio operator who's speaking to him, who's also pictured there, and he jumps out of his Lancaster bomber, falls to earth, but the angels miss capturing him and taking him to heaven, catching him and taking him to heaven. And there is this whole trial about him, should he go to heaven or not, but he's in love, and love conquers all, and it's really an emotive thing. But it also, these two films demonstrate an emotional turn in these films. It's not just about recruitment, it's not just about taking the war to the enemy, it's about making sense of loss, of death, and also of love, and just living through this massive experience of the Second World War. So it's come a long way, really. And also, again, both films have a strong element of looking at British and American relations, which is obviously very important, and building during the war, and of course what's going to happen after the war. So I think they play a very, very important part in this. But the main thing is this social cultural commentating along with this emotional turn. So the war has ended, and now I want to highlight one particular film, which is Appointment in London in 1953. Again, I think this is a really, really excellent film. It's very different, really, to any film before or since looking at Bomber Command. One thing I really like is the fact that it shows some elements of the German perspective as well, the defences. You've got an image there on the right. And it builds up to this raid at the end of the film, and it shows things like flares being dropped over the target, the Pathfinders, the element of the master bomber and such like. And a lot of this has to do with the fact it was written by John Woodridge, who was RAF. He was a bomber pilot himself, highly decorated, 97 ops, died at the age of 39 in a car accident, tragically. But I think this plays a key part in this. And there's things that are really good to get really excited about. So you have a great, strong female character in Dinah Sheridan, who is women's role. She's in the women's navy. Yeah, there's this great scene where they pick her up and she's not in uniform, and the aircrew start talking about, oh, we've got this intelligence officer and he's going to be an absolute bore and everything. And of course, it's her. She shows up, and I just absolutely love that scene. It's so brilliant, and they're absolutely embarrassed by it all. But Dirk Burgard is really the star of it. You've got him pictured there, and he's the CO. He's nearing the end of his operations. And yeah, he wants to play a part. And again, there is this emotional turn within this, and it deals with love and loss. So you've got this character who is ringing his wife before operations. He doesn't say he's ringing his wife, and there's a lot of suspicions. Why is he making these phone calls before operations and such like? There's some good scenes with ground staff as well, which is something I really want to give a nod to. The Irks, as they were known, these are the people that repaired the aircraft or answered the telephones or did the paperwork or were in the offices or the ops room, or etc., etc., etc. There's some good nods to them, and there's some very, very powerful scenes as well. So I really want to highlight that. And I think if you haven't heard of it or you haven't seen it, it's not one that's really embedded itself in British culture. And I'm quite surprised. I think maybe, I don't know what it is. It's probably overshadowed by the next film that I'm going to show, which is one you've probably heard of, The Dambusters. And I would argue this is probably the definitive RAF Bomber Command film. What is it about? If you don't know, well, you've got Lancaster bombers. They go deep into Germany and they attack these dams, which are to the east of the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany. Burst these dams, flood the valleys, flood the factories, and it's going to do immense damage to the Nazi war effort. And of course, well, I'm guessing you probably worked out they do achieve breaking 2 of the dams. It was originally a book by Paul Brickell, who also wrote The Great Escape and Reach for the Sky. So yeah, there is a track record there, although Great Escape was afterwards, of success making these novels, and they're adaptable to film and such like. Now, at the time, the real bomb, so it was a bouncing bomb, so it bounced along the water and then rolled down the wall of the dam and exploded. It was actually a mine, if you're going to be strict about it. That bouncing bomb was actually secret at the time. So the design on the bottom of the Lancasters, you can see there, isn't what it looked like. And actually, during the film, it's slightly blotted out, so you can't really see what it looks like. So that's kind of interesting. That shows how recent it was in relation to the film. You think 12 years difference. There are some incredibly powerful scenes within it. So one that definitely springs to mind is at the end of the op, you've got the breakfast tables in the morning, and of course you've got the empty ones because of the crews that didn't come back. And that would have been seen and played out right across all of the RAF bomber stations throughout the war. It's got incredibly evocative music, and it's got this firm place in British culture. It's definitely, for many, what sums up RAF Bomber Command, and it's coming up to the anniversary. It's going to be a big focus. I would argue it probably has a little bit too much focus in terms of detriment, not only to other films, but also other raids. And but this is the way that people remember Bomber Command. It's that means it's repeated. It's as I say, it's formed itself within British society. But things start to change as we hit the 1960s in terms of this cultural term within Britain. So in the 1960s, you have a new generation growing up and coming into the world. You have the flower power movement and such like that comes into it. You have the campaign for nuclear disarmament. This is the age, the nuclear age, nuclear deterrent. And you have people now questioning the morality of the bombing campaign over Europe. People are talking about Hamburg. People are talking about the bombing of Dresden. Tens of thousands of people being killed every night, or not every night, but on a night. And And there is this, I just want to mention the Beyond the Fringe sketch that is being, now this was on stage, but it was also televised, which we've got here, 1961, demonstrates some of the changes that we've got here. So it's the officer aircrew, the well-spoken officer aircrew, which is coming in, which of course wasn't always the case when it came to Bomber Command. Many were not of that. Many were sergeants, many were from all over the world, etc. And this turn fits in with what's actually happening with the First World War, this lions led by donkeys. And this sketch kind of sums this up. There's this little bit, I wish I was going with you, and all this sort of stuff. Talking to this aircrew that's about to go on a mission and such like. It's a good example of this turn, although it's a comedy sketch, and it was met with criticism and such like at the time. And this also kind of shows us a moving class as well. There's this element of it becoming a male officer aircrew war. Lower classes are usually the ground crews. They wouldn't be flying Lancasters, which is nonsense, because you did have people like that flying and being involved as aircrew on bombers. This upper class officer and this comic element is, of course, reflected later in things like A Lower Low with the British airmen that are behind the lines, and also things like the Armstrong and Miller sketches. Monty Python do it. It's very much this officer what tally ho, which is a caricature really, but it's embedding itself within British society, and this is kind of like the start of it. And the role of women changed too. And actually, that's one thing that I noticed. I watched the Dambusters recently. Is there's not a strong contingency of women within it. It's either Barnes Wallace's wife or they're serving breakfast and tea. It's not really showing the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in the way that it had been in, say, Target for Tonight. So there is this shift as well, which has happened. There are brief mentions of Bomber Command in other films. So you've got Operation Crossbow there. I'd love to see that developed into the raid, the Pinamunda raid that took place. That would be an absolutely great film. Any film developers listening, you might be listening to this. I would really think that would be great. And this shift in focus as well with Bomber Command, the moral element that's coming in, the Battle of Britain and RAF Bomber Command becoming very separate campaigns, very separate memories. And there's almost this sense of the RAF fighter pilots being the good element of the RAF, whereas RAF Bomber Command, there are lots of questions. And there's less focus perhaps coming in with ground crews. This is also kind of brought across in other films you see in the 1960s. So what I dubbed the two Mosquito films, the de Havilland Mosquito, brilliant, such a useful aircraft in the Second World War. This is a more acceptable, a socially acceptable example of RAF Bomber Command. It's precision, it's fast, it's not going to go anywhere near raising questions about Dresden and Hamburg. And also these, as I say, these are precision raids. So 633 Squadron is to destroy this rock that's going to collapse down and destroy this factory. Mosquito Squadron, you've got, absolutely taken from the Dambusters, a bouncing bomb that bounces on land this time, and that's going to just destroy a target. It's very much entering into this special raid. I mean, 633 Squadron, the music is absolutely iconic, absolutely fantastic. But these two demonstrate the acceptable shift in the narrative that's prevalent in the 1960s. Quick nod here to an international film, The Sky Raiders from Czechoslovakia. Though not so culturally significant in the UK, it is worth mentioning because these films are having an impact on the continent that are going to shift and eventually have an impact in Britain. I've got to give a nod to James Kitely here, who actually gave me a nod towards this film. It harks to older films, perhaps. It uses footage for Target to Tonight. It is about a main raid, and there is this sense of survival within it, hitting the target and then survival. I think it's really, really good. If you can track it down, which is doable, I would say do so. It's very, very interesting. And they adapted the equivalent of the Russian C-47 to make an airworthy or a taxiing Wellington bomber, which I think was actually reasonably convincing looking at it. Unless you're an absolute nerd and you spot little things like me, I think, yeah, to the general, it's know of a Wellington bomber. They do a pretty good job. So we now move to the small screen. So we're seeing this shift from the 1950s, from the coronation, topical. Now television is becoming a huge means of entertainment. And by the 60s, 70s, it is, it's possibly overtaking cinema. It will do, in terms of how people consume visually these dramas, these comedies and such like. I'll mention A Family at War. So this is about a family at war during the Second World War. There is a main character in David who is in RAF Bomber Command. He joins the RAF to get a job. There's no sense of heroism here. There's no sense of doing a duty for one's country and all this sort of stuff. He's not a nice character. He's a philanderer. You know, he has an affair when he's married, and it's not a great portrayal. But it's interesting that they chose him to be an RAF Bomber Command rather than Fighter Command. I think that's an interesting thing. You've also got, so I said there are these emotional turns, and actually I should have mentioned earlier that films like Appointment in London do start to touch on things like post-traumatic stress, and the term LMF, lack of moral fiber, that was used to air crews who were suffering from post-traumatic stress and were taken off duties and such like. I really recommend the work by Dan Ellen on this. It's an absolutely fascinating topic that, the Brillcrim Boys, I want to mention 1979. There are other plays. This is a TV play. There are other ones. But there's a very powerful scene in a hospital that demonstrates this bomber pilot with post-traumatic stress. And these other mad, and I use commas for that, aircrew joining in and walking along the corridor in this mock raid. So it's showing the psychological effect of bombing raids and such like. You do as well, and during the 1970s, have aircrew in TV programs like Secret Army and Colditz, which are also worth mentioning. So there is a strong RAF presence on TV, and you have had it in the 1950s and 60s as well. You also have, for RAF Bomber Command, the series Pathfinders. Now, this is a mini-series based on the Pathfinders. And those of you who don't know, the Pathfinders were usually going, this is more later on in the war, middle of the war, later on in the war, and drop flares over targets and mark them for the follow-up bombers to come and attack the targets. And they would have the more slightly cutter-edge technology. They'd usually be slightly more experienced crews, etc., etc. So this has got Jack Watling in, who I mentioned earlier, who was in Journey Together. He was ex-RAF, I should mention that. You also have Hamish Mahadi, who you've got pictured on the left there with the model Lancaster that they used. He was involved with the film Battle of Britain. He had played a huge part in getting many of the vintage aircraft together and airworthy for that film. On paper, this looks like it's going to be a great TV series, and I was very excited growing up going to watch it. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry if there are fans, I was a little bit disappointed. I thought the model sequences weren't particularly great. I thought the plot was a little bit all over itself. It loses itself, and I just think it was a missed chance. For me, it really had a lot going for it, and it just fell a bit flat. Again, maybe that's me. I don't know, and I apologize to anybody who liked it, but it just didn't grab me. But there we go. Anyway, we're moving on. We then have the production of Bomber Harris in 1989. So we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. Again, new generations are coming forward, and there is this sense of reflection. And Bomber Harris, if you don't know who he is, was head of Bomber Command from February 1942 until the end of the war, and is, well, thought of the commander when it comes to RAF Bomber Command, one of the main central figures, along with Guy Gibson and Leonard Cheshire, etc. Now, it starts when he takes command of Bomber Command. There's nothing about when he was in command of 5 Group Bomber Command or when he was in the air staff. And it stars John Thaw, the brilliant John Thaw. Originally, Anthony Hopkins was considered for the role, but John Thaw got it. And the TV movie, it really is. It talks about bombing policy, addresses a lot of the issues with technology and developments. It doesn't hide from the controversy, but it mainly leaves the audience to decide on Harris, whether he did the right thing or whether he was dictated by circumstances with a mixture of his own interpretations, understanding. factors such as Winston Churchill and the turn over Dresden, and the controversy over that, and the legacy of Bomber Command and how it was affected by that. It leaves it up to the audience to decide. And I really, really like the way that this production does that. I think it's very, very clever. There's an interesting use of music throughout as well. So it includes music from the time, but it also includes some strong classical music, and there's some evocative scenes with the beautiful Moonlight Sonata, Beethoven, which is just so powerful. And yeah, it really manages to get this emotional element in as well, watching it. Now, not long after that was released in 1992, you have a statue of Arthur Harris unveiled, Clement St Danes, the Strand, Westminster, near St Paul's. And when it was unveiled, it was met by a crowd of boos and people protesting against RAF Bomber Command, the bomber campaign, strategic air campaign. Now, the unveiling was led by the Queen Mother, and there were veterans there, including Leonard Cheshire. And if you watch and the scenes of this, it's incredibly powerful to see. And it's been vandalized since. There's an image there of it having been vandalized. There's a lot of growing emotional controversy now. There's a lot of reevaluation that has started beforehand, that has crept in, but it's becoming more focused and addressed in productions. And Bomber Harris really is a good example of this. The other thing I really like about Bomber Harris is that it includes the United States Army Air Force again, looking at this combined bomber offensive. I think it's easy to slip into, oh, it was RAF Bomber Command's war, oh, it was the 8th Air Force's war. Actually, no, they were talking to each other. There was a main plan. It was just up to, how it was executed, to a large extent was up to them. But there needs to be this understanding that there were broader things. And of course, the Air Forces did work directly together when it came to things like Operation Overlord and such like. And it's not quite as separate as, in fact, it's not as separate as sometimes it comes across. I just want to talk quickly about radio. So really, this is the main form of entertainment for many years. For many families, it's where news comes from and is important during the war as well. Cinema is obviously up there, but this is where, before television in the home, it was radio. Now we get Bomber Command and the war mentioned on numerous programs. I've got Hancock's Half Hour there that was a comedy. There are a fair few scenes actually that make references to bombs and being bombed and such like, and it's quite a fascinating little social commentary and such like. You have radio adaptation of Flarepath. You have quite a few productions and such like looking at the Bomber War and Bomber Command. But one I really want to mention is Bomber 1995. So there's a little bit of a jump. As I say, I can't include everything. Now, this was originally a book by Len Deighton. Len Deighton wrote things like the Ipcris File, Harry Palmer, and he just, gosh, I mean, you'll know a lot of his work. And brilliant author, famous author. The radio play was BBC. It stars Sam West there. You can see, you recognise him from All Creatures Great and Small. He was also in another RAF comedy this time, a year later over here. Emma Chambers, Vicar of Dibley was in it. You've got Frank Windsor, Jack Shepherd. It's a really good, really strong cast. And it tells multiple perspectives of the war. So it tells it from the bomber crews, it tells it from Harris's perspective, it tells it from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force's perspective, the defenses. It talks about the people on the ground being bombed. And I really like this multi-angled perspective. Themes of LMF, lack of moral fibre, as I mentioned before, are strong in it. It takes place over the course of 24 hours, the build-up of the raid on this small German town, which is actually bombed by accident. It's actually collateral damage. And yeah, it's this incredibly powerful portrayed. It's got elements of the myth of the clean Luftwaffe as well, and questions over this and Nazism. And gosh, Len Deighton really did do his research when it came to this. There's also mention of the ground crews, and there's a death of a ground crew member within it, similar to a scene in Appointment in London where a bomb falls out of the bomb bay of a bomber and crushes one of the ground crew. loading the bomber, which again is very, very powerful. And the scenes of there's one where I think it's the wireless operator is blown out of a bomber and falls to earth without a parachute, and it goes through his thought process as he's going. I mean, listen to this. If you haven't listened to it, do it. I think it's absolutely so powerful. It's absolutely one of my favorites. Track it down. It's out there. Another nod I want to make, actually, whilst we're talking about Bomber, is to the film Memphis Belle. Now, this has links to Bomber. I believe that originally Bomber was going to be made into a film, but it ended up being about the Memphis Belle. This is the United States Army Air Force. And there is a very powerful scene within it of letters being read. And these are letters from family talking about their lost husbands, brothers, sons, etc. And this is played out over real footage of American bombers being shot down and blown out of the sky. And within this film, it's just this nod to the reality of this death that was happening, and this loss, and the families that were feeling this, and things like the last time I saw Jackie was at the, I can't remember if his name was Jack. I saw him at the station, and he was so proud to be doing something important. And yeah, they're going, yeah, this guy had his head blown off, and read the letter that I had to write to his mother, and yeah, it's just incredible. But the extra element to that is these letters were RAF Bomber Command, which doesn't take away to the incredible bravery and effort by the United States Army Air Force, who were, yeah. But when you realize that, watching it, it adds an even extra powerful element. And another thing I really like about the film at the end is it gives a nod to all Allied aircrew. It isn't just this American focus and such like. But moving on, we go back to film. We go to the 1990s. You've got Map of the Human Heart, 1993. And I mention this because this highlights the raid on Dresden of February 1945, which probably, along with the dambusters, are the two most remembered raids for very, very different reasons. Dresden caused a massive political fallout, with Churchill basically washing his hands of his involvement with RAF Bomber Command, and led to questions over. And there's subsequent writings and after the war that add to this controversy. There's a lot of very, very controversial book. Well, there is one very controversial book that really influences this. And this is coming up as well over the 50th anniversary. So there is this next generation. There is this reevaluation and understanding that's happening. As well as that, you have 2006 Dresden, which is a German film, which is about a love story between an RAF aircrew bows out near Dresden and falls in love with this German woman. They both fall in love with each other. Then the raid on Dresden happens. And I think this is a little bit of a turn that we're seeing, in a sense of reconciliation, in terms of we've had the emotional turn and such like. This is a coming to terms and understanding and making another sense of what the bombing war meant. And I mention this because this is when you get the age. You've had VHS, but you get DVDs now. You get rental. We're slowly going into the streaming age of watching and consuming these things. So these are now having an influence on what's being consumed in Britain as well. You also have, I'll mention very quickly, Lancaster Skies 2019. I've got to be honest, I'm not really a huge fan of it. It's low production. I've got nothing against that. I think, you know, they put their effort into it, but I'm not quite sure what it's trying to do. There are emotional elements in it. There are some questions raised, but it doesn't really sit well with me. I don't know. It just doesn't really. I don't know what it's really doing, but I have to mention it. And moving on from that, as I say, there is this shift, there is this reevaluation, there is this generational thing as well. So you've got something like Night Flight, BBC 2002. I recognise Christopher Plummer there. Again, he was in the Battle of Britain film in the 1960s. Edward Woodward there, and this is. So they're veterans that go back to this abandoned airfield, and they start reminiscing and they start reevaluating the war. It's then interspersed with flashbacks of their experience. I haven't watched it for many years. I haven't been able to track it down, but I remember it being very emotional and very powerful. But it sums up this evaluation. It sums up generational changes, and the veterans now are becoming less and less. There is this sense of wanting to make sense of it all. I'll mention as well now 2021, the film The Bombardment, also known as Shadow in My Eye. Now this deals again with collateral damage. Sorry, I've just realized I used that term without explaining it. So essentially there is a target, but some of the bombs will miss and they'll hit areas that aren't the target, and they might be non-combatants, they might be civilians and such. Like, I can't go into full bombing strategy and talk about strategic bombing and area bombing and everything, but that's putting that down. And in this film you have mosquito bombers that attack a target. One of the mosquito bombers is hits a school, and many of the bombers that follow up think that is the main target. They start dropping bombs on this school, and you see the horrors of what's happening on the ground. It's a Danish film based loosely on a true story. Another element to make it powerful was that when it was released, it was pretty much as the war in Ukraine started. So I think it got a lot of people discussing that and thinking about that. And again, it is this international element. The RAF within it, there's mosquitoes, as I say. It isn't the officers' war anymore. There are some interesting scenes within it. They get the uniforms wrong, which really annoys me, but I'm a nerd and I get annoyed by things like that. And they use a Douglas Bader quote for the bomber pilots. I'll let that go, but yeah, little things like that. But it's a very, very powerful film, and I like the fact that it directly addresses and shows the effect of collateral damage and such. Like, it's a very thought-provoking film, very powerful, emotional film for me anyway. And this sums up this perspective that's coming from the continent, this international element of the bombed. What did it mean to those that were under the bombs? And with streaming, as I say, DVDs, this is becoming more consumed within Britain. So the first one I want to mention is Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. Now, those who might not know Sophie Scholl, an incredible person. She was a teenager in Munich, anti-Nazi, and her the brother formed this group, the White Rose, that wrote papers saying how bad and how Germany is suffering under the Nazis and how bad the regime is. And they were circulating this anonymously. Anyway, they eventually get captured, and they're tortured and eventually executed. They're guillotined. But there's this scene within the film where Sophie looks out and she sees a raid, and you see the target indicators falling down on this city. And at the end, there's this nod because her leaflets came into Allied hands and were dropped over German cities. So the word was still being spread by RAF Bomber Command. And that's another little powerful nod. And the way that the film does it, I think, is very, very powerful as well. And it's another element really to consider. You also have The Book Thief, based on a book. Very powerful scene, raid at the end, destruction on the German town and the main characters and the loss. And it's again coming to terms with this sense of surviving the war and such like. And the main character steals books to give to people to read whilst the bombing's going on. It's this distraction from the war. Again, these are now being consumed in Britain. It's now raising sort of different perspectives and different considerations and such like. It's a world away from films like the Dambusters or 633 Squadron. There's now perhaps being a fuller picture, and definitely Len Deighton's a part of that as well. That is coming to the fore. And yeah, it's seeing more of Germany and Germany's understanding of it and making sense. And again, there's this sense of reconciliation and such like. So, for instance, in the film The Dambusters, the only thing you see of the enemy are some workers running away from flooding in a factory, which is, again, different to Appointment in London, where you see the defences and such like. So, yeah, there's a lot of things to consider here. One I would like to quickly just go over is documentaries as well, because they play their part on the small screen and the large and the big screen as well. And you have One I really want to mention is The World at War, fantastic series that looks at the Second World War from 1973. Still stands strong today. Obviously, it's missing quite a lot of things. Files have been declassified. I mean, one of the ones that's always touted is the enigma and intelligence element that comes into it. But there is an element on the strategic bombing campaign, Whirlwind, which Marshal of the Royal Air Force Arthur Harris contributes to. I think it's a very, very interesting episode. It doesn't cover everything. It doesn't go right up to the end of the war, so it kind of avoids some of the controversies and such like. But it would have played that place in the popular narrative and memory because it was watched by a large audience, and it is still consumed today. It's still regularly shown on TV channels. You can get it on DVD and download it and stream it. Next one I want to mention is The Valor and the Horror, Death by Moonlight, Bomber Command, 1991, which is a Canadian documentary. I don't have much to say very favorably to this. It paints Bomber Command absolutely as villains, especially Harris, and so it paints some of the air crews as victims of being caught up in this war, but it's quite sensationalized. It's not, there are these scenes in between that are filmed, and you've got one there. It's just a mess, and actually veterans went to court over it because of the way that RAF Bomber Command was portrayed in it and such like, full of controversy. But I've got to mention it because it's playing this place. It's coming out in the early 90s. It is being circulated. It is influential in the memory and the controversy and such like. Also want to mention Lancaster Above and Beyond 2022. This is, again, mainly focusing on the Lancaster bomber. It's sort of a follow-up from their documentary on the Spitfire. The thing that I really like about this is, again, you're starting to get the multi perspective. So you do have someone who was there, a German woman who was there during the Dresden raid talking about it. But then you have the air crew, you have the Women's Auxiliary Air Force being talked about. It talks about lesser known raids. It talks about the dambusters, but it also talks about the raid on Nuremberg, for example, the worst night in RAF history, which is another talk that I gave for History Indoors, if you do want to check it out. A little plug there. This again sums up this change in direction with I mean, you do have it with The World at War from the German perspective, but again, it's this feeding in of what's happened with film and television. It is coming into the documentary and being consumed differently as generations come in and the memories change. And of course, the big thing you've had is 2012, the National Memorial at Green Park in London for RAF Bomber Command. This is unveiled after many years of campaigning. It's seen as too controversial, especially look at what happened to the Harris statue and such like. It's finally unveiled. It has been the scene of protest, of vandalism and such like. But it's there, and that's a massive turning point as well. And it's a massive sense of making sense of everything and coming to reconciliation. And the International Bomber Command Center in Lincoln is another example of this. So we're coming to the end. And yeah, Dresden is one of the prevailing memories when it comes to RAF Bomber Command, but we are getting this sense of new memorialization and reconciliation and coming to terms, making sense of it. But it's, yeah, TV has definitely played a part in this. TV and film and radio played a massive part of the public consuming this, making sense of this. It's reflected generational changes. It's reflected different consumption. So as I say, once you get DVDs and streaming, you get more of an international voice coming into it, different perspectives, as I say. And there is new senses of memorialization as well. But still, I would say that films like The Battle of Britain, First Light, Bomber Command probably are still in the shadow of the fighter pilots. And it's only the dambusters really that's still in the public imagination as for the film. And prevalent within British society and a representation of what RAF Bomber Command are and have become. And that was in the 1950s. So, you know, it's, whereas there's been quite a lot with the fighter pilots since, you know, it's very, very telling about evolving memories and such like. But as I say, the memorialization, the remembering is changing. Are we getting a more rounded and less sensationalized narrative I think we are. I don't think Death by Moonlight would be released now. And I think we are seeing shifts. We are seeing shifts in generation or another generation coming up and trying to make sense of it and trying to understand it. Dresden Memorial, for example, has a plinth to Coventry. Coventry was heavily bombed, most famously in a raid in November 1940. And it is this, again, I use this word reconciliation and understanding. And that's what it's now shifting. It'd be interesting to see how films change and reflect this. What will the centenary look like for the Second World War? What shift are we going in? I make a nod to the film A Memory Ode, which I've read the script for. I think is actually a very good example of this consideration of next generations, as that generation that went through the war is sadly slipping from us. And this is this notion of coming to terms and making sense of it, and coming at it afresh from multi angles and such like. But that is it. I've finally come to the end, and I'm ready for a few Q&As, a few questions. Michael.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you, James. That was a fantastic talk, and something that I can resonate with as well. You know, I've looked into this briefly as an undergrad many years ago. So, but to see that change, and even see that change, especially in the last 10 years as well, I think something to think about as well since the memorial was built.
Yeah, so. Definitely since the memorial.
Yeah. I've got a question to ask before we open up to people, because I saw Flarepath actually, because Flarepath was performed in 2011, 2012, 2013, I think, as well. Do you think that was performed because of the memorial being kind of presented, being made, that it kind of brought to life some of these maybe older presentations of Bomber Command? Did you think it was that memorial which kind of sparked like a few more kind of portrayals of it? Or do you think there's other reasons why that might have been presented
if it was 2012, it's probably linked to two things. It could be linked to the anniversary of the play, which I think came out in 1942. Someone's probably going to correct me, but also I think the fact that you do have the memorial in Green Park as well being built and unveiled, which is an incredible memorial, I have to say. I went, and part of my MA, I've been a couple of times since, but I went as part of my MA and I hadn't seen it before, took some photographs and some notes. I was there about half an hour, and within that time I'd say, I know, a dozen people had come up, stopped, looked at it. I think someone laid something on the ground, and there was a poppy growing, and someone took a photograph of it with the memorial in the background. I was just, wow, this is what it's about. People are coming here and doing what is needed, what they need to do, and it's the fact that it's still resident so strongly today says a lot.
100%. I've got another question as well, but I'll look at the comment section before I even dare ask my other question. James asked a question: would you welcome a Dambusters remake?
The short answer is no, but hear me out. I want to see some other elements highlighted. So I think I mentioned in the talk, a Peenemünde raid film would be fascinating. I'm going to bang my drum about the Augsburg raid. I think that would make an incredible film. You could really highlight something else and bring in these other elements and other stories. I would love to see Len Deighton's Bomber made into a TV production. I think the radio production was fantastic. The other thing I didn't mention actually about the radio production is that within it, they recorded interviews with some German people that had been under the bombs, with Luftwaffe personnel, with members of RAF Bomber Command and such like, and they intersperse it within the radio play. So similar to Memphis Belle, there's just suddenly this reality waking up of, okay, they're talking about this night fighter approaching the bomber. Then all of a sudden you're listening to someone that actually flew a German fighter at night and was aiming at these. And it's just, wow, or you're absolutely brilliantly done. If you haven't heard Len Deighton, if there's one thing I want you to go away and listen to, it's Bomber, Len Deighton, BBC radio production. It's just someone I've just seen, the Nuremberg Raid 2. That would be an absolutely incredibly powerful film if that was made. So yeah.
So I was also asked a question as well, which I think would be interesting. Would, if you're producing a film today, how would you approach the question of morality in the way you depict the actions on screen? I mean, that's a tough question, right? It's a very difficult question. I think it's one that you probably
Yeah,
can't answer in 5 seconds or even off the spur. But I mean, if there's,
yeah.
do you have any thoughts to share on that?
I think that the best ones have been Bomber and Bomber Harris, where everyone's walked away and come away with a different perspective or answer. It's left the audience to kind of decide. I don't think it works going in, going, okay, this was horrific because bombing is horrific, or it's not good going in, going, well, let's try and soften it up, or let's make it a very sort of gung ho thing. It needs to be real. It needs to be about people. It needs to have bad guys, but it also needs people that are caught up in it. It needs to show Nazism, but it also needs to show, I just think that the best things are just have that balance and are real and about people. They've been the most powerful ones to me. So yeah, Bomber Harris does it from the top down perspective, but then Bomber does it from a multi-angle perspective. I think they're the ones that are the most interesting. And like I say, when I've spoken to people about productions like this, they've come away with different interpretations, and I think that's fascinating because that is what surely history is, isn't it? I mean, it depends sort of what you listen to and what you take from it and what you focus on and that you decide to listen to more. And yeah,
I have to agree with you completely. I think if you try to control the narrative, I think then it's dangerous because then you've got a purpose. There's a reason behind what you're doing as well, which is always problematic. And you see what he said by Death by Moonlight. I mean, like that reaction towards that. When you're
yeah,
trying to direct a narrative, you're trying to present one image. All you do is just create an angle the other way.
yeah,
Like it's best to actually just present the history and let people. He said, let people. I think you're completely right. Let people make their own decisions
yeah,
because that's what history should be doing. It should be creating discussion, shouldn't it?
yeah,
Discussion, helping us to talk in the present day as well. I
yeah,
think Bomber Command allows us to do that. It allows us to talk about issues today as well, which I think is why it's such a useful history as
yeah,
well.
yeah. And I
So
mean, this is the thing with these. Some are being consumed more than others. Some are being repeated more than others on TV. Some are getting more cinema attention. Some are on, but they are in a public domain and they are being consumed. Some haven't aged well,
yeah, yeah.
So I get very nerdy about one of our aircraft is missing, but would the majority of people be as excited as I am? I'm quite confident in saying probably not. But there's that to consider when it comes to these things, but they are being consumed and they have had an influence, certainly when these things came out, some more than others, some less than others. But that's the thing, they're influenced by history and the interpretations of history and the writing of history, but then they themselves have then had an influence. Like Dambusters is a prime example, really, because when the film came the film came out after the book, all of a sudden there's this interest in Dambusters, and from what my understanding is there wasn't a great deal of accolade like there is today. People spoke about, I mentioned earlier, the Augsburg raid. They talked about the raid on Tirpitz. It was just as lauded as the Dams raid during the war and slightly afterwards. But the Dambusters got a book and a film, probably because it's got a wacky weapon or something. I don't know. There's that's slightly different. But I mean, yeah, that says a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, speaking of Dan Busters, there's a question on this, so you might as
Oh,
well
Dan.
just just ask it. So you've already spoken about the reception meaning of films when they came out. What about the
Mhm.
changing interpretations of films like Dan Busters, which you have hinted on, but
Mm.
um, the film has seen different interpretations and receptions over the last few years, especially.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Dan Bus is a really, really interesting example. Like I say, the fact that it has got a lot of focus. It has become significant in British culture and society when it comes to the bombing war and when it comes to RAF Bomber Command. Yeah, there are some elements that are definitely controversial today. There are things that it doesn't really directly say how successful the raid was. It skips away from the Zorpadam, for example. It talks about it during the film, but then they don't actually say what happened to the bombers that went there. Was it breached? Was it not? It's just swept under, So there's elements like that. And yeah, the Dambusters film is, I mean, it's a classic. I mean, I watched it, as I say, fairly recently, and yeah, it's a great film. But there are definitely problems with it. I say someone mentioned a remake. I think if it was remade now, it would be very different. I mean, there's elements like a large number of casualties from the Mona Dam. I can't remember the exact figures. There was an internment camp. I think it was Ukrainian women that was flooded, which of course isn't in the film. But why would it be? But that's probably something that would be in a version now. I don't know. That would be up to the directors and producers. But yeah, it does have these things. So yeah.
And it's something. And if it said you can put right, if it was remade now, there'd be different focuses, different aspects they'll bring out. It wouldn't be the same, which is good as well. It is good that it wouldn't be the same as well. So that is good in some parts. But yeah, it would be nice to see other films being made, as you said as well earlier, about different aspects of the raids, the lives involved.
Yeah.
I mean, someone's just mentioned a question here, which I just want to bring out very quickly. Has there been any films from the German perspective of the Bomber Command raid? I think you mentioned one earlier, but any other thoughts on that?
So Appointment in London has the German defences scrounging up the night fighters and tracking the raid and following it in. Bomber, the radio production in the book, has the German perspective, and it has about the defences and it has about coping with it and social cultural commentaries. But I know that Len Deighton did a lot of research in Germany for that. There were a few films, as I say, that talk about the perspective of the bombed. But in terms of Luftwaffe out and out film, none that I'm aware of, or no major ones that I'm aware of. There might be some independent films that have come out in the last 10, 15 years. That's not something I've really looked at, to be honest. And I've certainly not come across it. I mean, you've got the Dresden film there, which is the love story, which I discovered when I was researching about different films and perspectives and such like. But yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. Maybe that's something that could be done. I don't know.
It would be interesting to see. Something from that perspective, because again, that's another side of the bombing wall, which you covered yourself earlier in the talk, but something that we don't necessarily hear much of. Perhaps maybe more we need to hear more of as well in some aspects there as well. So certainly, good to do. I just think that there's a lot of people talk about dambusters remake. So I try have to kind of see if any other questions. Let's scroll up the.
Yeah, it's supposed to be Peter Jackson, wasn't it? I think, and I think some mock Lancasters were built, but that was years ago. It was first touted.
Yeah, I remember it being discussed as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a question. If there's any more questions, please put it in. But I mean, also, one thing I've noticed with a lot of the films that you noticed, it's Lancaster that kind of gets the focus.
Yeah.
I mean, why is that? I mean, you've got Lancaster Skies, you've got, the documentary you mentioned as well. Why Lancaster? I mean, I can answer this one, but I don't want to. I'm going to let you answer it. Why Lancaster? Why does it get the focus in Bomber Command films or in Bomber Command kind of kind of? I know you've got the Mosquito film, but in general.
Yeah, this is something that I have discussed before. Bomber Command, generally, the memory of Bomber Command comes in with Arthur Harris. It comes in 1942, and before that, it's really generally they didn't really do much. There wasn't much going on, which annoys me because there's so much going on, and there's so much to make sense of what happened later on. You need to look at the start of the war. So we need to talk about Wellingtons, we need to talk about Hamdens and Blenheims and such like. But the Lancaster, obviously over the course of the war, Bomber Command expands. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Harris, is a huge advocate of the Avro Lancaster. I believe he made some suggestions to the designs and such like. And it is the bomber that takes part in the Dams raid, on all these, the raids on the V1 sites. It has the tall boy bomb. It is the specialist aircraft that does these things. And there are more of them. It's just how the war production had moved. Of course, it's been memorialized at the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, which has kept that legacy going.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it is an incredible bomber. It is cutting edge when it comes out, and the fact that it's got this bomb bay that can take loads. I mean, it is just a flying bomb bay, and the crew and the rest of it are an afterthought. Really, it's about how can we jam as many bombs as possible into this and get it into the air. We better put some armor plating behind the pilot, but everyone else is just going to have to lump it, but yeah, that's why the Lancaster is there, and the way it's been memorialized. It's in films like the Dambusters and such like, and yeah, it's just it's this snowball effect. It's in things, and then it's the main bomber, and then all of a sudden it is the bomber that symbolizes Bomber Command, which isn't the case at all. I mean, I'll mention the handy page Halifax,
Get in there, yeah.
which I thought you
You
spell
better.
which again, I mean, that had teething problems, just so did the Lancaster, the early marks, but yeah, that's an incredible bomber as well. But the Lancaster, there's more of them produced. It's seen as more useful. Harris has got this thing about the Lancaster, and yeah, like all plays into it.
Yeah, and I think also, I'm just adding on, the Dambusters films, don't they? I mean, they create that in the legacy and in the memory as well. They kind of perpetuate it, so it does end up being the poster of it. And it's a lot of ways you say it quite rightly as well. But
Yeah,
I
well,
obviously would advocate for Halifax films.
Yeah, and very very quickly. I mean, the aircraft like the Hamdens and such like are shot down or scrapped because they go out of service, so they're not going to be in films. You've then got a build up of Tiger Force. Lancaster's still in service, so more of them survive, and you now have 2 airworthy examples. There is going to be a third, but no airworthy Halifax, because it just didn't capture the public imagination. There weren't that many. It wasn't in service for as long. Well, and all this sort of stuff factors into it. Similar thing with the Spitfire. Over the Hurricane, there's this mythology that comes out of it with films like The First of the Few and the Spitfire Fund, and the modernity that comes with it. And it is a beautiful, beautiful cutting edge aircraft, but it stays in service throughout the war. Hurricane doesn't. In production throughout the war, and it carries on afterwards. More survive, and then there's more about for when it comes to filming the Battle of Britain, so it's then in the public consumption, and yeah, all these things then play a factor in continuing it.
Yeah, exactly. But I had to ask a question anyway, because otherwise I wouldn't leave myself if they didn't ask that question. One more question for you, James, then we'll bring it to. Oh, there's another question actually at the end, so I'll have to.
Okay.
But we'll do this question first. Not movie, but a book. Where do you place Overy's The Bombing War in the canon of literature?
It's really important. It's very, very important in terms of the historiography, the narrative of the bombing war. I haven't read it cover to cover. I mean, he's covered this topic quite a lot, actually, and there are these key important books that, yeah, there are some elements I don't necessarily agree with and such like, but they are important. They have played that role in the wider narrative, and Overy is one of the big guns when it comes to this. It's a bit like Max Hastings' Bomber Command book, absolutely monumental when it came out in the 1970s, the way that it was written, but it would be a very different book now. I think actually you could probably say that about Overy's as well. I think there would be changes to it, but yeah, to really, really put it quickly. But I do place it up there. It's important, but yeah.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with that as well. And just ending on Karen's kind of comment here, going back to our previous comment about Lancaster in popular memory and in film, having one flying to also have one that can taxi as well. I think that certainly doesn't it, add to the reason why it's also still prevalent, and why if you're making a film, you would use Lancaster, because it's the one people can see, relate to, isn't it? Rather than if you use one that people don't know much about, it isn't going to be as people aren't going to be drawn to it, are they, as much, are they? So
yeah, but that's the thing. If there was an airworthy Wellington, we'd probably start talking about the early war bombers more. If there was one at air shows or one under restoration or whatever. I mean, you think of something like the Short Sterling. I think the most that exists of that is like a tail fin or something. There's hardly anything the most I think it's slightly more than that, actually, now that I think about it. But yeah, that's a massively forgotten bomber. I don't like using that word, but it is a bomber that's out of consciousness, and it was the first 4 engine heavy bomber.
Yeah,
so,
which was, I know about it. There we go. I know about it, but generally, yeah, you're all right. But we'll leave the questions here because of time. But also,
can I answer that last one? I just want to answer that last one.
The one here.
This is one I get excited. This is something I do get excited about. If you were to make a visual production about Bomber Command, would you go for a lengthy film like Das Boot or a miniseries, or stitch it to hour-long episodes? I would go for the miniseries, and I would go from the start of the war. I would talk about the raids on the German Navy, the Daylight. I talk about the Blenheims in attacking Luftwaffe airfields, about the Britain. I do the Hamdens. You could tell the whole story of different crews coming in and someone starting off as a young recruit and then becoming a senior officer by the end of the war. I think you could really do a wonderful sort of mini series covering it. But anyway, that's I've got excited.
Well, watch this space. Watch your space as you come to direct a film. But it is a good idea, actually. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of problem with lengthy films. You can't really do the topic justice.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting it with Masters of the Air. So why not Bomber Command?
There we go.
Band of Brothers style thing.
Yeah, perfect response there, James. I like it. I completely agree with you. But okay, we will end it. We'll end it there. Because we won't give you a rest as well, James. Otherwise,
Thank you.
But thank you everyone for coming. We thank you. Thank you for watching and asking questions and being involved in this discussion as well. We love talking about it. We love being able to talk with you guys as well. So we appreciate you being here. But thank you, James, more importantly for the talk, for preparing it, for presenting it with enthusiasm as well, and for engaging with this topic as well. So we really appreciate that as well. So thank you for this talk. Really informative, really interesting, and I know that we can all learn a lot from it as well. So thank you there. We've got talks coming up. We've got talks on the First World War. We've got talks by me on the Siege of Colchester. So if you do want to stay tuned, do subscribe, and do watch out for future talks. But until next time, thank you, James, again. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
My pleasure.
And we will see you all hopefully soon. So bye from me, bye from James, and we'll see you soon.